The first thing I noticed was the empty chair. It sat between my parents at the long dining table, polished wood gleaming under the soft Christmas lights, a chair that should have been mine. Instead, my name card had been moved. Quietly, deliberately. I stood at the edge of the room holding a glass of water I had not asked for, watching my family celebrate without me, and I understood something cold and final in that moment. This was not an accident. Christmas Eve at my parents' house had always been complicated, but that night carried a different weight. The air smelled like roasted turkey cinnamon and expensive perfume. Bing Crosby played softly from hidden speakers, the kind of music meant to feel warm and nostalgic. My mother, Elaine Harper, sat straight-backed in her cream sweater, smiling the way she did when guests were watching. My father, George Harper, laughed too loudly at my brother's jokes, his hand resting proudly on the back of his chair like he owned the room and everyone in it. My sister Claire sat across from them in a deep red dress, her engagement ring catching the light every time she lifted her wine glass. Beside her was Daniel, her fiancé, recently promoted, recently praised, recently welcomed into the family as if he had always belonged. And then there was me, standing, unplaced. I was 32 years old. I owned my own consulting business. I paid my own mortgage. I had survived things none of them ever had to imagine. And yet, in that house I was still the extra piece, the one that never quite fit. My mother glanced up and frowned, not with concern but with irritation, as if she had noticed a wrinkle in the tablecloth. "Oh," she said lightly, "you can sit at the end. We needed space for Daniel's parents." The end. Near the kitchen door, a folding chair had been added there slightly lower than the rest. No name card, no place setting yet. Something inside me tightened. Daniel's parents had canceled that morning. Everyone knew that. I had watched my mother move my card earlier, sliding it away from the center with a careful smile when she thought I was not looking. I did not argue. I never did. I told myself, like I always had, that it was not worth making a scene, that Christmas was about peace, that families were complicated, that I was being sensitive. But as I pulled out of the folding chair and sat its metal legs scraping softly against the floor, I felt the familiar burn of being minimized. Dinner unfolded the way it always did. Conversation flowed easily around me, over me, through me. My brother talked about his upcoming promotion at the firm. Claire shared wedding details I had not been invited to help plan. My mother nodded approvingly, my father beamed, and every success that was not mine was celebrated like a victory for the whole family. When I spoke, the room quieted just enough to acknowledge me, then quickly filled again with louder voices. At one point, my father raised his glass. "To family," he said, "and to legacy." Everyone clinked glasses. No one looked at me. I took a sip of water that tasted faintly of lemon and something bitter underneath. I thought about the years that led to this table. The birthdays forgotten unless I reminded them. The Thanksgiving when my plate had been cleared while I was still eating because dessert was ready. The college graduation they skipped because my brother had a golf tournament. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was used to it. Then my mother stood and tapped her fork gently against her glass. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice bright. Claire reached for Daniel's hand, already smiling. My brother leaned back smug. My father's eyes shone. My stomach dropped. Elaine took a breath. "As you all know, your father and I have been thinking a lot about the future. About making sure everything is clear, simple, fair." The word fair landed like a lie. "We met with our attorney last week," she continued, "and we finalized our estate plan." The room hummed with anticipation. "We've decided," she said, turning to Claire and my brother, "to transfer the lake house into your names, jointly. It has been in the family long enough, and we want it to stay that way." Claire gasped, hand flying to her mouth. My brother let out a low whistle. "And my father added the family business shares will be split evenly between the two of you." The room erupted into congratulations, laughter, tears, gratitude. I sat very still. No one looked at me. The silence stretched just long enough to be unmistakable. Finally, my mother turned toward me, her expression carefully neutral. "And for you," she said, "we felt it would be best to handle things differently." Differently. My heart began to pound. "You've always been independent," she went on. "You don't need help. You're not sentimental about things like property." And honestly, she smiled tightly. It wouldn't be practical to complicate matters. My father nodded as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. So he said, "We've decided there's nothing to transfer to you at this time." At this time. The words blurred together. I could hear my pulse in my ears. I looked down at my hands at the faint scar on my knuckle from when I learned to fix my own sink, because no one ever came when I asked for help. Nothing. Not the lake house I had cleaned every summer as a teenager. Not the business I had helped with unpaid work during lean years. Not even a conversation before the decision was made. Claire avoided my eyes. My brother shifted uncomfortably, then looked relieved when the attention moved back to him. I felt something crack inside me, slow and quiet. This was not just favoritism, this was erasure. I excused myself politely, standing on legs that felt strangely numb, and walked toward the hallway. Behind me, dinner resumed as if nothing had happened. Plates clinked, someone laughed. In the bathroom, I locked the door and stared at my reflection. I looked calm. Too calm. My eyes were dry, my face composed. Years of practice had taught me how to hold myself together in rooms where I was not wanted. But something had shifted. I realized, standing there, under the soft yellow light, that I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place that was never meant for me. I had been quiet when I should have spoken, grateful when I should have questioned, loyal when I should have walked away. And now at Christmas they had finally said the quiet part out loud. I did not belong in their future. What they did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was that while they were busy rewriting their legacy without me, I had been preparing my own. I left the house that night without saying goodbye. Snow had begun to fall, light and steady, covering the driveway in white. As I drove away, the glow from the windows faded behind me and I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not despair, clarity. They had made their choice, and soon, very soon, they would understand the cost of it. The morning after Christmas always felt quieter than it should, like the world was embarrassed by what had happened the night before. I woke up before dawn in my own bed, the sheets cold where I had tossed and turned. Snow pressed against the edges of my windows, muting the city sounds outside. For a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's voice. We felt it would be best. You don't need help. It wouldn't be practical. I got out of bed and padded into the kitchen, made coffee I barely tasted, and stood by the window watching a plow scrape past. My phone sat face down on the counter. I had not checked it since leaving my parents' house. I already knew what I would find. Silence or worse, messages, pretending nothing had happened. By 8 o'clock, curiosity won. I turned the phone over. One missed call from my mother at 6:42, no voicemail. A text from my brother sent just after midnight. Hope you're okay. Crazy night, let's talk later. And one message from Claire, timestamped 12:58. I'm sorry you felt hurt. That wasn't our intention. Felt hurt. I laughed, a sharp sound that surprised me in the quiet apartment. I did not respond. Instead, I showered, dressed, and sat at my desk where I usually worked. The laptop glowed to life, familiar and steady. This space had always been mine. No folding chairs, no rearranged name cards, just results. By mid-morning, I was deep into reviewing contracts for a client when my phone rang again. This time I answered. Elaine did not bother with pleasantries. You left abruptly last night, she said, her tone clipped. People noticed. Of course they did. That was always the concern. Appearances. I needed air, I replied. Well, she continued. Your father and I were disappointed. That was a family conversation. I leaned back in my chair, fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. A family conversation that excluded me, I said calmly. She sighed, the sound practiced. You're being dramatic. We explained our reasoning. No, I said. You explained your decision. Silence stretched on the line. I could picture her standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. You've always been sensitive, she said finally. This isn't about love. It's about logistics. There it was again, practical, logical, clean words meant to sanitize something ugly. I helped build that business, I said. I worked summers there for free. I covered expenses when cash was tight. I postponed my own plans so I could support this family. You chose to do those things, she snapped. We didn't ask you. The words landed hard. No, I agreed quietly. You didn't. The call ended shortly after, her frustration unresolved, my clarity sharpened. I spent the rest of the day working, but beneath every task, a quiet resolve formed. I thought about the years I had stayed silent, believing patience would eventually be rewarded. I thought about how carefully they had framed their decision, how comfortable they were assuming I would accept it. They had underestimated me. That afternoon, I pulled up the old emails and documents I had kept out of habit more than intention. Contracts I had drafted, vendor negotiations I had led, financial projections I had quietly fixed when numbers did not add up. I noticed things I had not allowed myself to notice before. Patterns. By evening, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Claire. She did not wait for me to speak. "You embarrassed Mom and Dad," she said, voice tight. This was supposed to be a happy announcement. "For you," I replied. "That's not fair." I exhaled slowly. Nothing about last night was fair. She paused, then softened her tone. "You're doing well. You don't need the lake house. You don't even like it that much." I pictured myself at 16 scrubbing mildew from the dock steps while she sunbathed with friends. At 20, fixing broken shutters while my brother practiced swings. "I liked being considered," I said. She scoffed. "You're making this bigger than it is." "No," I said, "I'm finally seeing it clearly." We hung up without resolution. That night, I opened a file I had not looked at in years. It was labeled simply with the company name. Inside were records of a restructuring that had happened quietly, almost carelessly. I remembered how rushed my father had been, how eager to push things through before the end of the fiscal year. At the time, I had trusted him. Now, with distance and clarity, something felt wrong. Numbers that did not align, assets moved without documentation, shares reassigned under the guise of simplification. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. The next morning, I called an old acquaintance. Not a friend, a professional, someone who owed me a favor. Her name was Margaret Lewis. She was a senior partner at a firm specializing in estate law and corporate governance. We had crossed paths years ago when I consulted on a project she oversaw. When she answered, her voice was warm but sharp. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "That caught my attention. Your family's name has been floating around lately," she replied. "Nothing public, yet." I told her everything. Christmas, the will, the exclusion, the patterns I was seeing now that I was looking back without blinders on. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she spoke carefully. "I think you should come see me." "Is this about money?" I asked. "It's about truth," she said, "and timing." 2 words that made my pulse quicken. We scheduled a meeting for later that week. When I hung up, I stood in my apartment feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Control. For the first time, I was not reacting. I was choosing. That evening, another message came in, this one from my father. "We need to talk. This has gone far enough." I stared at the screen, then typed a response I had never allowed myself to send before. "I agree, it has." I set the phone down and walked to the window. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the city clean and deceptively peaceful. Somewhere across town, my parents were likely reassuring themselves that I would calm down, that I would return to my place at the end of the table. They had no idea that while they were protecting their legacy, I was about to uncover the truth beneath it, and once I did, the table would turn. Margaret Lewis's office sat on the top floor of a narrow glass building downtown, the kind of place designed to feel neutral and intimidating at the same time. Pale walls, clean lines, no personal photos. When I arrived that Thursday morning, the city below looked distant, muted by fog. Margaret greeted me with a firm handshake and a measured smile. She was in her late 50s, silver hair cut precisely at her jaw, eyes sharp in a way that missed nothing. She gestured for me to sit across from her at a long table scattered with folders. "I want to start by saying this," she said. "What you're feeling right now is not about money. It's about erasure." I nodded, my throat felt tight. "Families often disguise favoritism as practicality," she continued. "But legally speaking, practicality leaves fingerprints." She slid a folder toward me. "These are public filings from the last 15 years related to your family's company," she said. I didn't pull them out of curiosity. I pulled them because someone else already had. That sentence landed heavier than the rest. "Who?" I asked. Margaret folded her hands. "A junior associate in my firm flagged inconsistencies during a routine review for an unrelated client. Same industry, similar structure, patterns stood out." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were balance sheets, transfer records, and handwritten notes in the margins. I recognized my father's signature immediately. The way he looped his G too wide, pressed down too hard on the pen. My stomach clenched. "Your father moved assets before declaring them," Margaret said calmly. "Reassigned shares during periods when valuation was intentionally understated. On paper, it looks like simplification. In reality, it's strategic omission." "Is it illegal?" I asked. She paused. "That depends on intent and timing, but it's questionable enough to matter." I leaned back, absorbing that. "And the will?" I asked. "The way they structured it." Margaret nodded. That's the interesting part. Your exclusion is not neutral. It conveniently aligns with shielding certain assets from scrutiny. My pulse quickened. They didn't just leave me out, I said slowly. They positioned me out. Yes, she replied. You were a variable they didn't want complicating the narrative. For a moment, all I could think about was Christmas Eve. The empty chair, the careful language, the way my mother had avoided my eyes. This was not emotional negligence, this was calculation. Margaret continued. You have standing. Not because you were promised anything, but because of your documented involvement, your unpaid labor, your financial contributions, your advisory role. I was never an officer, I said. You didn't need to be, she replied. You were an asset. The word hit differently than it would have once. She closed the folder and looked directly at me. Before we talk about options, I need to ask you something important. What do you want? The question startled me. Not what was fair, not what I deserved, what I wanted. I thought of my parents' house, the lake, the business dinners, the years I spent hoping they would choose me. I want the truth, I said, and I want it documented. Margaret smiled slightly. Good, because truth has momentum. She explained the process carefully. First information. Quietly. No accusations yet. Then leverage. Not threats. Facts. Timing would be everything. If you confront them too soon, she warned, they'll close ranks. You'll become the problem. But if you wait, if you let the structure reveal itself, they won't see you coming. I left her office with copies of documents and a strange calm settling over me. That evening, my brother showed up unannounced at my apartment. He stood in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets, eyes tired. This has gotten out of hand, he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He paced while I stood still. Mom's been upset, he continued. Dad's furious. They think you're talking to lawyers. I said. He stopped pacing. Why? I met his eyes, because I finally decided to stop pretending. He shook his head. You're going to tear this family apart. I almost laughed. No, I said quietly, I'm just refusing to hold it together anymore. He looked at me, then really looked, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. What do you want? He asked. The same question, different weight. I want honesty, I said, from you too. He hesitated, then slowly he sat. There were meetings, he admitted. About the will, about the business. Dad said you'd complicate things. Complicate how? He swallowed. He said you asked too many questions. I nodded. That sounded like my father. And Claire, I asked. My brother sighed. She didn't want conflict. She went along with it. The room felt smaller. When did you know? I asked. He looked away. A while. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet apartment, the weight of his admissions settling in. Betrayal rarely arrives loudly. It comes in soft confirmations, in things you already suspected but hoped were wrong. The next morning, an email arrived from Margaret. Subject line timing. She had attached a summary. Short, clean, irrefutable. A regulatory review had been scheduled. Routine but inconvenient. My father's company had been flagged for irregular reporting. It was not because of me. But I was no longer invisible. That afternoon, my mother called again. Her voice was tight. You need to stop this. Stop what I asked. This narrative, she said, you're making us look bad. I closed my eyes. No, I said, I'm letting the truth speak. You're being vindictive. I thought of the folding chair, the empty place, the carefully crafted exclusion. No, I replied, I'm being accurate. She hung up on me. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote everything down. Dates, conversations, memories that suddenly made sense. I realized something then that changed the way I saw myself. I had not been weak, I had been observant. And now with clarity and documentation on my side, I was no longer reacting to their choices. I was preparing for mine. The storm they thought I was causing had already been forming long before I spoke. All I had done was stop standing in the rain. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope with no return address. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Sharp. Controlled. Each letter pressed as if to assert authority even on paper. I did not open it right away. I set it on the kitchen counter beside my coffee and let it sit there while I showered, dressed, and answered emails from clients who trusted me more than my own family ever had. By the time I finally slit the envelope open, I already knew what it would say. It was not an apology. It was a warning. Your actions are damaging this family. You are mistaken about your assumptions. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences. I read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because it confirmed something I had needed to see in writing. My father did not deny anything. He did not correct facts. He simply asserted control and threatened loss. The old version of me would have folded right there, would have questioned herself, would have wondered if she was exaggerating. Instead, I smiled faintly and placed the letter in a folder I had labeled documentation. By Wednesday, the calls began. Not from my parents, but from people I had not heard from in years. A former vendor who said my name had come up during a review. A retired accountant who had once worked with my father and wanted to meet for coffee. An old family friend who awkwardly asked if everything was all right, and then hinted that she had always wondered why I was treated differently. The silence that had protected my parents for decades was thinning. I met Margaret again that Friday. She read the letter without expression, then placed it on top of the growing stack of documents. "This is good," she said. "It doesn't feel good," I replied. "It's leverage," she corrected. "Threats imply fear." She explained that the regulatory review had expanded. Still quiet, still contained. But questions were being asked. Records were being requested. And most importantly, timelines mattered. "They are scrambling," she said. "And scrambling leads to mistakes." At home that night, I received a message from Claire. She asked if we could talk privately. No parents, no agendas. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a cafe halfway between our apartments. She arrived late, eyes darting around the room, as if expecting someone to recognize her. "You didn't have to do this," she said after sitting down. I stirred my tea slowly. "Do what?" All of this, she gestured vaguely. The lawyers, the digging, the tension. I looked at her carefully. My sister had always been beautiful in an effortless way. She had also always been protected. "I didn't start this," I said. "I responded to it." She leaned forward. "You could have just accepted it. You've always been strong, independent." There it was again, the compliment that excused neglect. Why, I asked quietly, was I never strong enough to be included? She faltered. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "it's honest." She looked away, then back at me. "Dad was afraid." "Of what?" "Of you," she said softly. The words settled between us like dust. She explained that my questions, my attention to detail, my refusal to blindly trust numbers had always unnerved him. He liked control, predictability, and I had never fit neatly into his plans. So instead I said he sidelined me. She nodded once. Something inside me hardened, not with anger, with clarity. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone," I said, "but I'm not protecting them anymore either." She reached across the table, hesitated, then withdrew her hand. "I don't know how this ends," she said. "I do," I replied, with the truth. The following week, the first official notice arrived at my parents' house. I was not there to see it, but I heard about it within hours. My brother called, voice strained. "They're auditing past filings," he said. "Dad's furious. He thinks you reported him." "I didn't," I replied honestly. "But you knew it was coming." "Yes." He exhaled sharply. "This is serious." "I know." There was a pause, then a quieter question. "What do you want from us?" The question again. This time from someone who had benefited from my silence. "I want accountability," I said, "and I want space." The space came whether they wanted it or not. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. The family group chat went silent. And yet oddly, I felt lighter. With each day that passed, more pieces fell into place. Margaret's team uncovered inconsistencies I had suspected but never confirmed. Deferred liabilities, inflated valuations, strategic omissions timed around key transfers. It was not just unethical, it was systemic. One evening, as I organized documents at my desk, I realized something else. The will was not just an exclusion, it was a shield. By cutting me out, they believed they had removed the one person who might ask why. That belief was about to cost them everything. The turning point came quietly. An email from Margaret's subject line simply marked "Update." A preliminary report had been drafted. Not public, not final, but damning enough that settlement discussions were being floated internally. "They want to contain this," Margaret wrote. "And that gives you power." Power. The word still felt foreign on my tongue. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, my parents were likely pacing their living room, wondering how control had slipped so far from their grasp. They had always assumed my silence was compliance. They were about to learn the difference. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since Christmas. Not because things were resolved, but because I no longer doubted myself. The narrative they built without me was collapsing under its own weight, and I was finally ready for what came next. The first time my father asked to meet, he did it through an intermediary. Not my mother, not my brother, A man named Thomas Reed, the family attorney who had been quietly rearranging documents for years. His email was polite, carefully worded, and entirely self-serving. He suggested a private discussion to clarify misunderstandings before matters escalated unnecessarily. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Margaret without comment. She replied within minutes, "We will respond, on our terms." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday in a neutral office downtown. No family homes, no sentimental territory, just glass walls and legal neutrality. I arrived early and took a seat at the long table. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. I placed my notebook in front of me, hands steady, posture relaxed. Margaret sat beside me, composed and watchful. My father entered with Thomas at his side. He looked older than he had on Christmas Eve. Tired. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. When his eyes met mine, something flickered there, not remorse, calculation. We did not hug. "Let's be clear," Thomas began after introductions. "This meeting is informal." Margaret smiled thinly. "There's nothing informal about a regulatory inquiry." My father shot her a look. "This is family business." "Then you should have treated it like family," she replied calmly. Silence fell. My father turned to me. "You've created a situation," he said, "one that could have been avoided." I met his gaze. "You created it when you decided I was expendable." He scoffed. "You're emotional." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm precise." Margaret slid a document across the table. "Let's talk about the transfer in the third quarter of the year you restructured. The one where assets were undervalued just long enough to reassign ownership." Thomas stiffened. My father did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was tight. "Those decisions were legal." "Legal is not the same as ethical," Margaret replied. "And intent matters." My father turned back to me. "What do you want?" The question again, always framed as inconvenience. I took a breath. "I want acknowledgement, public or private. I want my contributions recognized, and I want to be included in any resolution that affects assets I helped sustain." Thomas frowned. "That complicates things." "Yes," I said, "that's the point." My father's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong in this." The old sting rose, but it did not land. "I already am," I said, "whether you like it or not." The meeting ended without agreement, but not without consequence. Thomas left looking unsettled. My father left angry. Margaret and I stayed behind. "They underestimated you," she said. "They still are." That evening, the first rumor surfaced. A trade publication ran a short piece noting that my father's company was under review for historical compliance issues. No names, no details, just enough to rattle investors. By morning, my phone was buzzing. A former colleague asked if I was all right. A client expressed concern about my family name being in the news. My mother left 3 voicemails without speaking, just heavy breathing before hanging up. Then came the call from my brother. "Dad's panicking," he said. "He's talking about settling." "With whom?" I asked. "You," he replied. "He wants you to make this go away." I closed my eyes. That's not how accountability works. "You're destroying him," my brother said. "No," I said quietly. "I'm letting him face himself." The next few days moved quickly. More information surfaced. Not leaks, discoveries. Former employees cooperated. Old emails resurfaced. Patterns that had once been hidden behind loyalty and fear were now impossible to ignore. One night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by papers and quiet. I thought about the younger version of myself, who believed love was earned by silence, who believed patience was virtue even when it erased her. I wished I could reach back and tell her the truth, that her worth had never been in question, only her visibility. The second meeting was requested 2 days later. This time, my father asked directly. We met again, same room. This time he looked defeated. "I built this," he said quietly. "I sacrificed everything." "So did I replied. "You just never counted mine." He looked at me, then really looked, and for the first time I saw something close to fear. "What happens now?" he asked. Margaret answered. "That depends on whether you choose transparency or resistance." He swallowed. "And if I resist?" "Then the review continues," she said, publicly. The word hung in the air. My father closed his eyes. When he opened them, his voice was hoarse. "What would transparency look like?" I leaned forward. "It looks like rewriting the will," I said. "It looks like acknowledging my role. It looks like stepping back and letting the truth stand." He nodded slowly. "And if I do that, you might salvage your integrity," I replied, "but not your control." He signed nothing that day. But when he left, his shoulders were no longer squared. That night I received a message from Claire. She wrote that she had always known this day would come, that she was tired of pretending everything was fine, That she hoped I would not hate her. I did not reply. The next morning, Margaret called. "They've agreed to mediation," she said. "It's not victory, but it's movement." I stood at my window watching the city wake. Revenge, I realized, was not loud. It was not cruel. It was simply refusing to disappear any longer. And the more visible I became, the smaller their excuses grew. The end was approaching. Mediation began on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the sky pressed low and heavy, as if the city itself were listening. The conference room was larger this time. Neutral artwork, a long oval table, water glasses placed at equal distances to suggest balance where none truly existed. My parents arrived together but sat apart. That alone told me more than any words could. My father looked worn down, his confidence frayed at the edges. My mother appeared composed but brittle, her smile fixed too carefully, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Thomas Reed sat between them, papers stacked neatly, his posture rigid. Margaret sat beside me, calm and unmovable. She had warned me the night before that mediation was not about justice, it was about exposure. People revealed themselves when they believed compromise was possible. The mediator began with pleasantries, ground rules, reminders about confidentiality. I barely heard him. I was watching my mother. She had not looked at me once. "We're here to resolve misunderstandings." Thomas began, his voice smooth. "This family has experienced tension, but we believe it can be addressed constructively." My mother nodded. "We want peace," she added softly. Peace, another word used to excuse silence. Margaret spoke next. "Peace requires acknowledgement. Let's begin there." She slid forward a document detailing my unpaid labor, my financial contributions, and the advisory decisions I had influenced over the years. The mediator raised his eyebrows slightly as he scanned the pages. "I was never compensated," I said evenly, "and I was never recognized." My father shifted. "You never asked." I met his eyes. "I never thought I had to." Silence settled again. The mediator cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper, Mrs. Harper, do you dispute these contributions?" My father hesitated. My mother spoke first. "She was always helpful," she said. "But she was family. We didn't keep score." Margaret's voice was calm but sharp. "You did keep score. You just didn't include her name." My mother bristled. "That's unfair." "No," I said quietly. What was unfair was pretending my effort was invisible. For the first time that morning, she looked at me. Really looked. And something flickered there. Not guilt. Fear. The discussion moved to the will. Thomas explained their position. The assets had been distributed in a way they believed reflected tradition, continuity, and practicality. I noticed how often those words appeared. Never fairness. Never contribution. When it was my turn, I did not raise my voice. "I am not asking for charity," I said. "I am asking for accuracy." The mediator nodded slowly. Then Margaret introduced the next document, a timeline. It showed exactly when asset valuations had dipped, when shares had moved, when restructuring occurred, all aligned with periods when I had been pushing for transparency. The room shifted. My father's face drained of color. "This," Margaret said, "is why exclusion matters. It wasn't emotional, it was strategic." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "That's an interpretation." "It's a pattern," she replied. My mother spoke suddenly, her voice trembling. "We were protecting the family." I leaned back, studying her. "From what?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The mediator leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper, what were you protecting them from?" She swallowed from scrutiny. There it was. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father slammed his hand lightly against the table. "Enough! This is spiraling." "No," I said, "this is clarifying." He looked at me then with something like disbelief. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "I'm surviving it." The mediator suggested a break. In the hallway, Margaret handed me a bottle of water. "You're doing well," she said. "I feel like I'm watching strangers," I admitted. She nodded. "That's what happens when the illusion breaks." When we returned, the tone had shifted. Less defensiveness, more calculation. Thomas proposed an amendment to the will, a financial settlement, quiet, contained. Margaret shook her head. "Inclusion is not a payout." I spoke then, surprising even myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I want my name restored. I want acknowledgement of my role in the company history. And I want an independent review to proceed without interference." My father stared at me. "You're willing to burn it all down." I met his gaze. "You already did. I'm just standing in the light." My mother began to cry. Real tears this time. The mediator paused, offering tissues. I never thought it would come to this, she said softly. Neither did I replied. But here we are. By the end of the session, nothing was signed, but something fundamental had changed. The illusion of unity was gone. As we stood to leave, my father stopped me. I don't recognize you, he said quietly. I looked at him, really looked, and felt no anger. That's because you never tried, I said. That night, I sat alone again, the city humming softly outside my window. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. They're running out of moves. I set the phone down and thought about the woman I had been taught to be. Quiet, accommodating, invisible. She had protected them for years. And now, by choosing herself, she was finally free. The next phase would be harder, louder, more public. But I was ready. Because this time I was no longer asking for a seat at the table. I was deciding whether the table deserved to stand at all. The shift from private reckoning to public consequence happened faster than I expected. 3 days after mediation, the first article appeared online. It was careful, restrained, written in the neutral language of business journalism, but the message was unmistakable. My father's company was under expanded review. Historical discrepancies were being examined. Governance practices were being questioned. No accusations, just facts. That was all it took. By noon, my phone began to ring. Former clients, industry contacts, people who had once praised my father's leadership now asking cautious questions, their voices lower, their tone guarded. I answered none of them. Silence, I had learned, could be power when used intentionally. My parents did not call. Instead, my mother sent an email. It was long, rambling, and filled with emotion. She wrote about sacrifice, about how hard it had been to keep the family together, about how I had always been strong and independent, and how she assumed I did not need the same reassurance as the others. She never mentioned the will, or the business, or the folding chair at Christmas. I did not respond. That evening, Margaret called. The board is fracturing, she said. Your father's support is thinning. I closed my eyes and let that settle. Not with satisfaction, with inevitability. What happens now, I asked. They'll try to control the narrative, she replied. And that's where things get interesting. She was right. The next morning, a statement was released by my father's company. It framed the review as routine, the concerns as minor, the leadership as cooperative. It emphasized legacy, stability, and trust. It did not mention me, but the omission was loud. Within hours, a second article appeared. This one less gentle. It referenced internal sources. It quoted former employees. It mentioned a family dispute without naming names. That afternoon, my brother showed up again. He looked exhausted. This is getting out of control, he said, sinking into a chair without asking. Clients are pulling back. Dad's being questioned by people he used to intimidate. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from him. Why are you here? I asked. He rubbed his face. Because I don't know what to do. For the first time, he did not sound defensive. He sounded lost. They're asking me questions, he continued, about the restructuring, about decisions I signed off on without fully understanding. I raised an eyebrow. You signed? He nodded slowly. Dad said it was standard, that it was just paperwork. I leaned back. That paperwork mattered. He stared at the floor. I didn't think you'd push this far. I didn't think you'd go along with it, I replied quietly. That landed. He looked up, eyes sharp with something like regret. If this goes public, it'll destroy everything. No, I said. It'll reveal it. He stood abruptly. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. I'm done absorbing it. After he left, I sat alone thinking about how often I had carried the weight of other people's choices. How often I had been told to be patient while others benefited from my silence. That patience had cost me years. The next call came from Thomas Reed. His tone was different now. Careful, almost deferential. We need to discuss containment, he said. There's nothing to contain, I replied. Only truth. He exhaled. Your father is prepared to revise the will. I felt a flicker of something, not relief, recognition. And I asked, he's willing to acknowledge your contributions, publicly. I closed my eyes. In what context? A formal statement, Thomas said. A correction. I considered that. And the review, I asked. He hesitated. That would continue. Then no, I said. He sounded startled. No, I'm not trading silence for scraps, I replied. The process stands. The line went quiet. That night, I walked the city streets alone. The air was cold, sharp, grounding. I passed restaurants filled with families, couples leaning toward each other, laughter spilling out into the dark. For years, I had believed I was missing something fundamental. Now I understood. I had not lacked family, I had lacked honesty. The following week, the audit findings were escalated. This time, names were named. My father's company stock dipped, partners distanced themselves, a board member resigned quietly, another followed 2 days later. And then finally, my father called. His voice was stripped of authority. "We need to talk." "We've been talking," I said. "No," he replied, "we've been avoiding." We met at his office late in the evening. The building was nearly empty, the lights dim. He looked smaller behind his desk. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I did not respond. "You were always capable," he continued. "I assumed you didn't need us." I met his eyes. "You assumed wrong." He swallowed. "What do you want now?" The question again. But this time it was not a challenge. It was surrender. "I want the truth to stand," I said, "without edits." He nodded slowly. "And after that?" he asked. "There is no after," I replied. "There's only accountability." When I left that office, I felt no triumph, only release. The next morning, a formal acknowledgement was issued. It named me. It credited my role. It admitted oversight. It did not undo the damage, but it changed the record. As the fallout continued, I received messages from people I had never met. Women, daughters, employees, people who had recognized themselves in the quiet margins of my story. They thanked me, and in their words I found something I had never expected: belonging. The storm was far from over, but for the first time it was no longer centered on my silence. It was centered on their choices, and that made all the difference. Public truth has a way of changing private behavior. After the acknowledgement was released, the tone around me shifted almost overnight. The messages I received were no longer cautious or confused. They were direct. Some were supportive. Some were opportunistic. A few were quietly hostile. That was how I knew the balance had truly changed. People were recalculating. The first invitation came from a journalist I did not know personally, but recognized by reputation. She asked for a comment, not an interview, just a statement. I declined, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned something important over the last few weeks. When you rush to explain yourself, you give others the power to frame you. I was done being framed, Margaret agreed. "Let the facts breathe," she said. "They don't need your voice to stay alive." My parents' house went quiet. No calls, no emails, no sudden attempts at reconciliation. The silence felt different this time, not punitive, strategic. They were waiting to see where the ground would settle. Meanwhile, the review expanded again. This time it pulled in an outside firm, independent, thorough, uninterested in family narratives. That was when the calls from extended relatives began. An aunt I had not spoken to in years left a voicemail saying she always knew something was off. A cousin messaged me late at night asking if I was okay and admitting she had felt invisible growing up too. A former neighbor sent a long note apologizing for not stepping in when she noticed how differently I was treated. Each message landed gently like a small weight being lifted. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk reviewing client notes, my mother showed up unannounced. She stood in my doorway, coat still on, eyes red-rimmed but alert. "I won't stay long," she said. I gestured for her to sit. She did not. "I need to understand," she continued, "why you didn't come to us first." I studied her face. The lines around her mouth were deeper now. The confidence she once wore like armor was frayed. "I did," I said. "For years, just not with lawyers." She flinched. "You never complained," she said weakly. "I adapted," I replied. "That's not the same thing." She looked around my apartment as if seeing it for the first time. The books, the awards on the shelf, the quiet order. "I thought you were fine," she whispered. I met her eyes. "You thought I was manageable." Her breath caught. She sat then slowly as if the strength had drained from her legs. "I protected the family," she said. "That's what mothers do." I nodded. "You protected the image." Tears slid down her cheeks, real this time, uncontrolled. "I didn't know how to fix it," she said. "That doesn't make it my job," I replied gently. She stayed a few minutes longer, then stood and left without asking for forgiveness or offering an apology. It was the closest thing to honesty she had ever given me. That evening, Margaret called with news. "The board is preparing to vote," she said. "Your father's position is no longer secure." I closed my eyes. "And you?" I asked. "I'm staying out of it," she replied, as planned. The vote happened 2 days later. My father stepped down before it could happen. The resignation letter was brief, carefully worded, full of phrases like personal reasons and transition planning. It fooled no one. The story moved fast after that, faster than I had anticipated. Analysts speculated. Former partners distanced themselves publicly. Employees whispered. And then came the moment I did not expect. A class action inquiry. It was early, preliminary but serious. Former employees alleged misrepresentation. Vendors cited delayed payments masked by accounting tactics. The company issued a statement denying wrongdoing while pledging cooperation. I watched it all unfold from a distance. This was no longer about me. And that was the strangest part. One afternoon, my brother called again. His voice was different, quieter, humbled. "I'm stepping away from the company," he said. I absorbed that in silence. "I should have asked more questions," he continued. "I should have listened to you." "Yes," I said. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added quickly. "I just wanted you to know I see it now." I believed him. That did not change what had happened. "Take care of yourself," I said. After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at nothing. Revenge stories often promise satisfaction, a clean arc, a clear winner. This was not that. This was slower, heavier, more human. I was not watching my family collapse. I was watching a system built on denial finally fail. That weekend, I drove out of the city alone. I parked near the water and walked along a trail, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I thought about the girl I had been, the woman I had become, the space between them. For the first time, I did not feel defined by what I had lost. I felt defined by what I had refused to give up. When I returned home, there was a letter waiting for me, handwritten, my father's. I opened it carefully. He wrote about regret, about fear, about how control had felt like safety to him. He did not ask me to fix anything. He did not ask me to speak on his behalf. He ended the letter with a sentence I read twice. "I see now that silence was never your weakness, it was mine." I folded the letter and placed it in the same folder as the first one, documentation. The difference was clear. One was a threat. The other was an admission. As the week ended, messages continued to arrive from strangers who had followed the story closely enough to recognize its shape. They thanked me for standing still when pressure demanded retreat. They told me my story helped them name their own. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, resolution. The truth had done what truth always does when allowed to stand. It changed everything. And there was still one final turn waiting. The final turn did not arrive with drama. It came quietly disguised as paperwork. Margaret called early on a Thursday morning, her voice steady but intent. "Something surfaced during the expanded review," she said. "It involves you directly." I sat up in bed, the familiar tension tightening in my chest. "In what way?" "Inheritance," she replied. "Not the will you already know about. Something older." That woke me fully. We met that afternoon in her office. The city outside looked sharp and cold, winter light bouncing off glass and steel. Margaret had a single folder on the table when I arrived, thicker than the others, older. "This wasn't hidden," she said as I sat. "It was ignored." She explained slowly, carefully, as if laying fragile pieces side by side. Years before my parents restructured the company before the lake house, before the polished image of stability, my grandmother had established a trust, a quiet one, modest in public description but deliberate in intent. She was specific, Margaret said, about fairness. I felt my breath catch. My grandmother had died when I was young. I remembered her hands more than her voice. How she used to press a cookie into my palm when she thought no one was watching. How she once told me very softly that being observant was not a flaw. She divided assets evenly among grandchildren, Margaret continued, but she also included a contingency. Any grandchild excluded from a future primary inheritance would retain rights to the trust independently. I stared at the folder. My parents knew I asked. "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Your father was named executor." The room seemed to tilt. He had known, all along. Not only had they cut me out of their will, they had done it knowing there was something they could not touch. Something they hoped I would never discover. Margaret slid the document toward me. The trust had matured. Quietly, fully. The amount was not extravagant. Not compared to the business or the property my siblings would inherit. But it was clean. Uncontested. Mine. More importantly, it came with documentation. Proof that exclusion had been anticipated and corrected. "This changes the narrative," Margaret said. "Not legally, morally." I closed my eyes. My grandmother had seen it, decades ago. She had seen the imbalance forming the way attention flowed in one direction and silence filled the rest. She had planned for it. I left Margaret's office with the folder under my arm and a strange mix of grief and gratitude twisting inside me. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. That night, I did something I had not done since this all began. I cried, not from pain, from release. Someone had believed me before I even knew I needed believing. The next morning, my mother called. Her voice was softer than I expected. I heard about the trust. Of course she had. You knew, I said. She did not deny it. Your father thought it would never matter. I closed my eyes. It mattered. Yes, she whispered. It did. We sat in silence on the line years of avoidance stretched thin between us. I don't expect anything from you, I said finally. Not now, not later. I know, she replied. For the first time, her voice held no defense. The trust did not change the review. It did not stop the inquiry. It did not undo what had been done. But it did something quieter and deeper. It rewrote the story they had told themselves. They had believed I was left with nothing. They were wrong. That weekend, the final report was released. It was measured, detailed, thorough. No criminal charges, but consequences, fines, restructuring mandates, oversight. My father's name would forever be attached to it. The story moved on as stories do. New headlines replaced old ones. Attention shifted. But something inside me had settled. I met Margaret one last time to finalize paperwork. When we stood to leave, she paused. You handled this with integrity, she said. That's rare. I smiled. I learned it from being overlooked. She nodded. Sometimes that's where the strongest vision comes from. That evening, I walked through my apartment, slowly touching familiar objects, as if seeing them for the first time. The life I had built without their approval suddenly felt solid, earned. I placed my grandmother's trust documents in a drawer beside my journal, not as a trophy, as a reminder. I was not an afterthought. I never had been. The following day, I received one final message from my father. It was brief. She was smarter than I gave her credit for. I should have listened. I did not reply. Some acknowledgments do not require response. That night, I sat by the window watching the city lights come on one by one. I thought about the arc of everything that had happened, the exclusion, the confrontation, the unraveling, and I understood something clearly for the first time. Revenge was not watching them lose. Revenge was realizing I had never needed their permission to stand. One chapter remained. Not about them, about me. The quiet after the storm felt unfamiliar. For weeks, my life had moved to the rhythm of phone calls, documents, meetings, and revelations. Every day brought a new shift, a new consequence, a new piece of truth surfacing where silence once lived. Then suddenly, there was space. I did not know what to do with it at first. I woke up one morning and realized no one needed anything from me. No lawyers waiting for answers, no family crises pulling at my attention, no journalists circling. Just my apartment, the soft hum of the city outside, and my own breathing. It felt almost unsettling. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table longer than usual, watching steam rise from the mug. I thought about how often I had lived in reaction mode, responding, adjusting, making myself smaller so other people could remain comfortable. That version of me had been very busy. This one was not. Later that morning, I went into my office for the first time since the final report was released. The building was quieter than usual, holiday decorations still lingering in corners slightly out of place now. My assistant greeted me warmly, careful not to ask questions. I appreciated that. As I settled at my desk, an email notification popped up. It was from a client I had worked with years earlier, a woman in her early 60s who had once confided in me during a project review that she was considering leaving her family business after decades of being overlooked. I had not heard from her since. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Her message was short. She wrote that she had followed the story quietly, that she recognized herself in it, that she had finally told her sons she would no longer quietly clean up their messes behind the scenes, that she had hired her own attorney and reclaimed her seat at the table. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. That was when it truly landed. This was never just my story. Throughout the day, more messages arrived. Women I did not know. Some older than me, some younger. Many writing from places of long-held silence. They spoke about being excluded from wills, from businesses, from decisions, from acknowledgement. They spoke about being told they were strong, independent, resilient, as if those words excused neglect. They thanked me not for fighting, but for standing still long enough to be seen. That afternoon, Margaret called. "I wanted to check in," she said. "Not as your attorney, as a person. I'm learning how to be quiet again," I admitted. She smiled through the phone. "That's part of it." She asked what I planned to do next. I thought about that before answering. For the first time, I said slowly, "I want to choose without reacting." She approved of that. After work, I drove out of the city again. The same trail by the water where I had walked weeks earlier, but it felt different now. The air was cold, but clear. The sky stretched wide, unburdened. I sat on a bench and watched the water move slow and steady. I thought about my grandmother, about the trust she had created quietly without drama or confrontation, how she had chosen foresight over conflict, protection over explanation. I understood her better now. She had not tried to fix the family. She had simply refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. When I returned home that evening, there was a package waiting at my door. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box and a note written in careful handwriting I recognized immediately. My mother. Inside the box was a bracelet I had not seen in years. My grandmother's. The one she used to wear every day. The one my mother had said was lost after the funeral. The note was short. She would have wanted you to have this. I should have given it to you sooner. No apology, no justification, but also no denial. I sat on the floor holding the bracelet, the weight of it grounding me. It was not expensive, not ornate, just simple gold worn smooth with time. It felt like continuity. I did not call my mother, I was not ready for that. But I did text her one word. "Thank you," she replied hours later. "You're welcome." That was enough for now. In the weeks that followed, life did not return to what it had been. It became something else. My father retreated from public view. My siblings rebuilt their lives in quieter ways. We existed on parallel tracks, no longer colliding, no longer pretending. I did not attend family gatherings. I did not receive invitations, and I did not miss them. Instead, I built something new. I began mentoring women who reached out to me. Informal conversations at first. Coffee, phone calls, then more structure, workshops, panels, conversations about visibility boundaries and truth in family systems that preferred silence. I did not frame it as revenge. I framed it as clarity. One evening, as I prepared notes for a small speaking event, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked different. Not younger, not older, lighter. I realized then that revenge had never been about taking something from them. It had been about taking myself back. The folding chair at the end of the table no longer haunted me. It felt distant now, like a symbol from another life. I understood what it had represented, not my worth. Their fear of what I might see if I sat closer. As I turned off the lights that night and settled into bed, I thought about how many women had been taught to confuse silence with grace, endurance with love, erasure with peace. I hoped my story gave them something different. Permission. The final chapter was no longer about confrontation or fallout. It was about stepping forward without asking. And that was where my real life began. The invitation arrived in early spring, tucked between ordinary mail and a stack of client contracts. Cream-colored envelope, formal script. My name spelled correctly for once without hesitation or erasure. It was for a small conference in Santa Barbara. A gathering focused on women legacy and leadership later in life. The kind of event my mother used to attend as a guest, never as a speaker. They wanted me on the main panel. I set the envelope down and stared at it for a long time. A year ago, I would have questioned whether I belonged there, whether my story was too personal, too uncomfortable, too disruptive. Now the discomfort felt like the point. I accepted. Standing on that stage weeks later, looking out at rows of women mostly in their late 50s and 60s, I felt a calm I had never known before. These were women who had lived, who had raised families, built careers, survived divorces, betrayals, and disappointments they rarely spoke about out loud. They were not here for polish. They were here for truth. I did not begin with the business or the will or the audit. I began with the chair. I described the folding chair at the end of the table, the way it scraped against the floor, the way it told me everything I needed to know without saying a word. I watched recognition ripple through the room. I talked about silence, how it had been mistaken for strength, how endurance had been praised while boundaries were punished, how many of us had been labeled independent when what people really meant was convenient. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then one woman stood. She said she was 63 years old, that she had worked in her husband's company for 30 years without title or pay, that her name was not on the will, that she had always told herself it did not matter because she loved her family. Her voice shook when she said, "I don't know who I am without being useful." I walked toward her and spoke without notes. "You don't lose yourself when you stop being useful," I said. "You find yourself." The applause was not loud. It was deep. After the panel, women lined up to speak to me. Some cried, some laughed nervously, some simply took my hand and thanked me for saying the thing they had never been allowed to say out loud. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it all settle. This was the part no one warns you about. After justice comes grief. Not for what was taken, but for what might have been if love had been braver. I thought about my father, about the man he might have been if he had not confused control with care. I thought about my mother, about the choices she made to protect stability at the cost of intimacy. I did not excuse them, but I finally understood them. An understanding I learned was not forgiveness. It was release. When I returned home, I found a message waiting from my brother. He wrote that he was in therapy, that stepping away from the company had forced him to confront things he had avoided for years, that he did not expect a relationship, but he wanted me to know he was trying to become someone different. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied honestly, "I'm glad you're doing the work. That matters. Nothing more. Nothing less." A few days later, I received another message. This one from an unknown number. It was short. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." No name, no explanation. I knew exactly who it was from. I did not respond. Some truths did not need dialogue anymore. Spring moved forward quietly. My days filled with work that felt aligned, conversations that felt mutual, choices that did not require permission. One afternoon, I found myself back at my parents' house for the first time since Christmas. Not for a holiday, not for a meeting. For closure. The house looked smaller, less imposing. The lake beyond it calm and indifferent. My mother opened the door. She looked older, softer, not defeated, changed. We sat at the kitchen table where I had once eaten alone so often. She poured tea with steady hands. "I'm selling the house," she said. I nodded. "That makes sense." She hesitated. "I wanted you to hear it from me." "Thank you." She studied my face. "You seem peaceful." "I am," I said. She nodded slowly. "I always thought peace came from keeping things together." I met her eyes. "Sometimes it comes from letting them fall." She did not argue. When I left, I did not look back. That night, I sat in my apartment and opened my journal. I read the first entries I had written months earlier. The anger, the disbelief, the quiet ache of finally seeing what had always been there. Then I turned to a blank page and wrote one sentence. "I am no longer waiting to be chosen." I closed the journal and set it aside. The last step was approaching. Not revenge, completion. One final chapter, and it would not be about them at all. The morning I realized I was done waiting felt ordinary. No announcement, no phone call, no dramatic moment where the sky opened or the past knocked on my door one last time. I woke up stretched and noticed something simple. My chest felt light, not empty, light. The kind of lightness that comes when you are no longer carrying things that were never yours to hold. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake up the way I always had. Cars moved. People hurried. Life continued without asking whether I was ready for it. For the first time I was. Over the next few weeks, I finished what I had quietly started months earlier. I formalized the mentorship work into a small nonprofit arm attached to my consulting practice. Nothing flashy, no grand speeches, just structured support for women who had spent decades doing invisible labor for families and businesses that never intended to credit them. We called it Clear Table, not because everyone would always get a seat, but because no one would be hidden anymore. The first workshop filled within hours. Women in their late 50s, 60s, even 70s. Some had built companies alongside husbands who took sole credit. Some had raised children who expected loyalty, but never offered respect. Some had been written out of wills with the same careful language my parents had used. "You don't need anything. You're strong. You'll be fine." I listened to their stories without interruption. I watched recognition pass between them like a quiet current, and I realized something that made my throat tighten. This was the family I had been missing, not by blood, by truth. One afternoon after a session ran long, and the last woman left with a relieved smile, I sat alone in the quiet room and thought about the word revenge. It had followed my story everywhere, in messages, in headlines, in whispers, but standing there I understood what it had never meant to me. Revenge was never about watching them fall. It was about refusing to fall with them. My parents sold the house by the lake that summer. I heard about it through a third party. I felt nothing sharp when I learned. No satisfaction, no sadness, just distance. My father moved to a smaller place near the city. My mother downsized and joined a volunteer group. My siblings built lives that no longer brushed up against mine. We did not reconcile. We resolved. That distinction mattered. One evening, as I was organizing old files, I came across the photo of my grandmother again, the one I kept tucked into the back of my journal, her eyes steady, knowing. I finally understood what she had given me. Not money. Permission. Permission to see clearly. Permission to stand still. Permission to trust what I noticed. I whispered thank you into the quiet room and felt something inside me settle for good. Months later, at another speaking event, a woman asked me a question that stayed with me long after the room emptied. She asked, "How did you survive being excluded for so long without becoming bitter?" I thought carefully before answering. "I didn't avoid bitterness," I said. "I just didn't build a home there." The audience nodded, some smiled, some wiped tears. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the floor with my journal one last time. I wrote about the folding chair, about the will, about the trust, about the storm and the quiet that followed. Then I wrote the truth I had spent my whole life circling. I was never excluded because I lacked value. I was excluded because I threatened a story built on control. When I closed the journal, I felt complete, not healed in the way movies promise, not untouched, but whole. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been told to wait your turn, to be patient, to be grateful for scraps of recognition while others feast on your labor, I want you to hear this clearly. Silence is not virtue when it costs you your dignity. Loyalty is not love when it demands your erasure. And family is not defined by who claims you, but by who protects your truth. My story did not end with an apology. It did not end with inheritance or reconciliation. It ended with choice. I chose myself, and everything changed. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear that their quiet strength was never the problem. And if you want more stories about justice, truth, and the moment the tables finally turn, subscribe and stay with me.